what an inspiring room. When I look across 500, did you say 500 people here?
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the saying that says, all boats float when we come together. And I'm so privileged to have been invited to host this panel, so thank you for that. We are going to talk tonight around being bold and being different and what that means from a diversity and inclusion perspective. So I'm going to start the conversation by asking, what is the state of diversity and inclusion in Canada today? And I'll start with Brian.
Well, first of all, to be bold, you need to wear bold socks. That's step number one. But you know what I would say, I think Canada's in a great spot. I think we've made great progress, but there's still work to be done. So, and I'm an ex-finance guy, so if I think about numbers and we look at some of the surveys that have been done out there, if you look at the percentage of women, for example, coming out of university and are representative of the workforce, so call it 50% of women are part of entry-level jobs in the financial services industry. If you then fast forward and say, okay, what's the percentage of women in C-level roles within the financial institution industry? That drops to 20%. So that shows that, despite the fact that we've got 50% of women out there, only 20% are in C-level roles. And if we look at Canada and we look at visible minorities and women in leadership positions, call it anywhere between 6 to 18% make up that percentage. Now, the statistics actually show that when they did an IMF studies of banks across the world, that banks, and you look at their board composition and you said, okay, banks that had a higher proportion of women on their boards had stronger capital ratios, they had lower non-productive loans, and they were better able to withstand stress scenarios. The fact is, having women in leadership positions at banks makes you a stronger bank. Yet, when you then look at how many women CEOs are there in the Canadian banks and how many women CEOs do you have of banks on Wall Street, it's zero, right? And if we look at visible minorities, I don't know the percentage on that, but the majority of bank CEOs are white males, despite the fact that it's been proven that having a diverse leadership team, having women in leadership team makes you a better bank. So I think we've made great progress. Those statistics are all getting better within Canada, but I still think we've got lots of work to do as it relates to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in May I read this headline. It was clickbait, and it said, Fortune 500 has more female CEOs than ever before. And it was 33.
Yeah.
6.6%. So I'm going to ask Poonam, because I know this is your platform. What do you think about that?
I'm so glad you said that, Chisholm. I believe I read somewhere that there are more Fortune 500 CEOs named John than there are female CEOs. So that statistic's actually correct. So tip for everybody, if you're expecting a boy, name him John. I'm a consultant. I reverse engineer success. Listen, I think to Brian's point, while a lot of progress has been made, the fact that I'm actually even sitting here, if I look at even just our business from a professional services standpoint, globally, I'm the only female business leader in my business that's in Canada. Shocking to me. And so from a progress standpoint, it's great that we've made strides and I get to actually sit here and talk about it. But the reality is, when you look outside and look around, that is not a common reality. And so what I'm optimistic about is the opportunity to have the dialogue, the opportunity to talk about institutional and systematic barriers to actually having women in particular in leadership. And what we can do as individuals, obviously, to progress that dialogue. And the dialogue, in my view, has to be this concept of all in. So this notion of when we think about women in leadership, we aren't talking about a zero-sum game. If one gets the opportunity, the other doesn't get the opportunity. The conversation, I think, has to shift to collectively, when we actually provide opportunities to bring a best version, how do we create more opportunities for both men and women, for Canadian-born individuals, but also immigrants for that matter. The specific dialogue I was engaging in this morning as I was preparing for this panel as well, while gender diversity is an issue, I see that from a racial diversity as well. But a more concerning report I read this morning was RBC published a report that talked about even wage parity issue between Canadian-born employees versus immigrant employees. And when we quantify that quantification of wage gap can actually lead to increase in GDP to up to $50 billion. So I think the business case is there, Brian, for all of us to understand and appreciate. But I think we're still on that journey, and it feels like a long-term journey ahead of us.
So I guess my question is why? What are the barriers and what are the challenges to diversity, to taking advantage of the significant gain in performance? Maybe Kevin?
Well, I actually think, what gets measured gets done. And so we've put out measures, and it tells you that we're not all the way there, because our measure is we want 40% of our VPs to be female, and we want 25% to be visible minorities. So obviously, it should be 50% female and should be a much higher percentage visible minority. So it's not all the way there, but breaking it down, measuring it, reporting on it, holding leaders accountable for it, and seeing the splits of different teams. Because one of the interesting things is different teams have different achievements on that measure, right? So depending on the area of the company you are, and once you start measuring those things and showing the impacts, that shows you where maybe there's a leader who's not getting it and needs to do more and needs to understand more and needs to think about how they're building their team more, and maybe needs to be get some more education or experience or training in terms of the power of a diverse team. Because I think some people are afraid of diversity, right? Some people don't see the power of a diverse team. So once you start measuring it, once you start demonstrating it, once you start living it, not perfect by any means, but in the last 6 months, I've been involved in interviewing 5 senior VP candidates that were women that we brought on board. 2 of them were visible minorities, 3 of them report to me. But part of this is measuring it, thinking about it, being open to it, getting experiences like this, bringing people to experiences like this and letting them see the power of a group like this. I think those are kind of the important pieces of that.
I think I was just going to add to what Kevin just said. I think Manjit, you and Kelvin both commented on in your opening comments. It's also a little bit on redefining what leadership means. I think leadership has been defined in a very narrow, sort of masculine way to date, and perhaps in the context of being very confident, loud, type A, perhaps even extroverted, and there's attributes that is associated with leadership that still continues to be very masculine. And so I think when we think about some institutional barriers around why women in particular don't seem to show up at leadership levels is, I think, the opportunity to expand that definition. And I think that will open up the aperture and make it more aspirational too.
I might just add to that just quickly, because before coming back to Canada and CFO for Sun Life, I was the president of our Asia business. And interestingly, for example, our Philippines management team was over half female. Right. Our Indonesia management team was over half female. I actually never even thought of it. Our Hong Kong management team was half female. And I think that it's when you work with, when you see the power of a team that operates differently because it's getting that more sort of diverse viewpoint and definitely a different style of leadership, it opens you up to being more open to those things. So I think making sure you're watching, you're learning, you're listening, you're connecting, longer term, that has a lot of power.
I think that makes a lot of sense and sort of echoes, Kelvin's remark when he was up here around representation. And when you're able to see someone who is like me or close to being like me, it really helps to have something to aspire to. Now, Brian, you spent some time overseas as well. Yes. You want to talk a little bit about your experience and maybe how the diversity or was it different there? I mean, I think having global experiences?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to have spent 4.5 years living in the Caribbean. And for me, I was the minority there, living in Barbados for 4.5 years. And, for me, one of the things that I actually learned about that is sort of the different priorities in life. And, here it's about getting material goods, getting that promotion, getting a job, being able to buy a house, raise a family, buy a nice car, put your kids through education, whatever, right? There it's about living life, right? And it's just very interesting in terms of seeing that dynamic and what they valued. And, an example would be sort of Friday afternoon, things would quiet down, there wouldn't be a lot of email traffic. We would leave, you'd go and get together and have a drink. Saturday, there's always
amazing.
Yes, but Saturday there would be always some sort of party, some sort of kids party, birthday party, you name it. The parents would stay at the birthday parties. You'd have to serve drinks for the parents would get drunk, whatever, right? And you'd have a party, but it was the whole family would have a party. And then Sunday morning you'd get up and you'd go to church. And it was about looking forward to the weekend and spending time with your family. And, we were a public company. We issued 2 full annual reports. We had a public listing. We had 65 people in finance. We still got our annual report out within the same timelines. We still had all the same disclosure requirements, versus you had 1,100 people back here within Canada. Yeah. And so you found a way to make it done and find balance and have balance to your life. So for me, that taught me a lot about what I could learn from a different culture and bring it back, that it's not just about getting the work done. It's not just about putting in time and working on the weekend.
Your team to hear you say that.
My team knows that.
That to me speaks as well to this notion of not just visible diversity, but also diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. At Ventures and in my previous life, we often have these multidisciplinary teams that approach problems. Can you talk a little bit about how diversity of thought plays into your strategy, into your makeup of teams?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first, guys, join in. We are a people business. So when I think about what we do for a living is think about creative ways of solving complex problems. And today in the world that is increasingly complex, it is more imperative that we actually harness the various ways of addressing that problem and solutioning that problem. So I would say personally, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a very tangible shift in the idea around neurodiversity. So my team has looked so different over the last few years in terms of we have people that are info designers, they're graphic designers, they actually come from ad agency experience. They're thinking about the human experience and how an actual end consumer would consume the information you're communicating. You're looking at leaders that have engineering backgrounds, legal backgrounds, accounting backgrounds. And what that's allowing us to do is actually address a problem in a multifaceted way versus a singular way in which we would have historically addressed. I'll give a very simple example. Like growing up in the audit business, if somebody told you, for the auditors in the room, we want to look at, a fraud risk assessment. In particular, we're looking at a branch and addressing bank robberies. The traditional way would have been everybody on the audit team was probably an accountant, probably understood the 10 risks that actually relates around fraud in a branch scenario. You'll go and interview a bunch of people and say, what are the controls in place, and evaluate it. Now what we think about is, all right, what would be the motivation of somebody to actually commit a fraud? Can we actually go interview a fraudster? Can we actually meet somebody who's been in law enforcement, who's actually prosecuted somebody who's robbed a bank? And the ideas that you get around the human psychology of why the motivation exists in the first place allows you to design a solution that is truly getting to the heart of the issue, is how do we change culture in an organization that allows you to do the right thing? So, it's just an example of how when you actually have a team that's diverse, it brings a perspective that you hadn't thought of before, which I believe is increasingly important in all our businesses.
I love that you hacked the hackers. Very cool. I don't know, Brian, Kevin, do you have any other thoughts in terms of diversity of thinking?
Yeah, I think diversity of thinking is important. I've always said my best ideas were always ones that someone else gave me, and I've just used them. But the more that you can encourage diversity of thought, and the more that you can build a team that's diverse, just the better you're going to perform. So, like, if we do a very simple exercise, okay. You got to be clear. You got to think of a number, okay? Don't overthink. This isn't a psychological thing. So I'm going to make a statement. Think of a number. My neighbor just bought an expensive car. My neighbor just bought an expensive car. How expensive was that car? Give me a number. 50,000. Anybody have more than 50?
$250K.
How much? 500,000. Oh, okay. Anybody have more than 500,000? Anyone more? Okay. Anyone have less than 50,000? How much? 30,000. Okay, so that's an example of how something as simple as saying, what's the definition of an expensive car can range from 30 to 500,000. If you have a diverse team and you're trying to solve a problem, or if you have a team that's just like you and you just thinks the same way that you do, what are you going to do? You're going to end up with the solution that's the same. We're all going to say it's 500,000. But if you have a broad mix of people that think differently, you can come up with different ideas, be innovative, and think outside of the box. So that's just a very simple example of how something as small as that can really give you a broad range of answers.
I might give an example around running a global business and ideas that come. If my personal belief, 5 years in Asia, if Sun Life wasn't in Asia, a lot of the innovation that we see coming in the next 10 or 15 years, we would miss, right? We would miss because in Asia, I can remember one time I had a debate, and I had to debate the head of Canada, the head of Asia, or the head of the US, and then I was the head of Asia. And my key point at the start was, Kevin Doherty's got a great business in Canada. Sun Life's awesome in Canada. We've got 35 million people that live in Canada. We've got a great group benefits business in the US. Dan runs a benefits business that has 10 times the number of clients, so there's a lot of potential. 10 times the number of people, 350 million. The countries we're in Asia are over 3 billion people. So if you think about the power of what's happening in a developing economy in a developing country, and we were able to do things like, in 3 of the countries we're in Asia, we tried selling through telecoms. And we went to the biggest telecom in Malaysia, the biggest telecom in the Philippines. We were working with a telecom in India. And we started to try to sell through there. It's really hard to do in a developed business, right? It's hard to do. In Hong Kong, we offered a diabetes management product because Hong Kong's just 8 million people in a very small area. There was a clinic that we could help people manage their diabetes, so we could experiment with that. We bought into a company called Bowtie, which is selling only direct. And in Hong Kong, it was started by actually 2 University of Waterloo students from Canada who had moved back to Hong Kong. We were able to work with a digital bank in Vietnam. We were able to experiment with things because of the size of the markets, because of where the markets were, and bring that thinking back to North America that we couldn't have done before. And I was saying to you earlier, Suzanne, that Sun Life's been in Asia for 125 years. For 125 years, product ideas went from Canada, or sometimes the US, to Asia. The technology we use went from Canada to Asia. People like me went from Canada to Asia. The next 125 years of Sun Life, the product ideas are going to come from Asia back to Canada. The technology is going to go from Asia back to Canada. The people are going to go from Asia back to Canada. And if you don't have that diverse view of what's happening, it's going to be really, really challenging. And Canada globally has a huge advantage because we have a diverse workforce like this, right? We have people who can understand what's happening in multiple parts of the globe, and we're also very welcoming to people who are going to move from Asia. Like my fiance has moved here from Vietnam, and she's
not an actress.
Not an actress. No, she's an actuary.
Very different profession.
Very different, and I was flattered but anyways, but no, she's not an actress. But she is an actuary, and she was head of wealth management bank there. But she feels so comfortable here. She moved here, and she's like, oh, I feel like like, this is great. I can go and get great Asian food, and there's great Vietnamese food, and there's great Chinese food, and the people, and the openness of the culture. So I think that's a huge advantage for Canada, that we have this diverse workforce and this diverse city, the most diverse city in the world, that we can really, really leverage, because that's the way that things are going to happen.
Well said. Well said. I'll switch gears here just a little bit and ask you, you're all leaders, very successful leaders within your organizations, and we have many leaders and aspiring leaders in this room. How do you coach your teams on moving beyond in environments where sameness is can be quite prevalent? How do you coach your teams? How do you coach yourself and your teams in terms of moving beyond the sameness that you see and really opening up to either different ways of thinking, whether you're in a singular function or otherwise?
I'll say a couple of things. One thing that I've been recently inspired by is Ray Dalio, who sort of talks about radical candor and radical openness and transparency. And it's a way of sort of living life and being a leader, but it's beyond just your professional life. And I've started to adopt that, and I see effective leaders, and I'm not proficient in this by any means, but when you're a leader and you're in a room and you have a strong voice and you lay out your position, often you'll find that your opening idea becomes the idea. And so the notion of when you're radically open, you're actually giving space to people in the room to think and to challenge and to provide a perspective that's actually contrary to your viewpoint. But that requires real discipline, tenacity, but also abandonment of ego. So as a leader, it's probably flattering sometimes to actually come up with the best idea, but it's pretty humbling to realize it's probably because nobody wanted to challenge you in the room. But ideas fail because we didn't really think through the diversity of options that could have been available to you. So I would just encourage leaders in the room, and I will say, leadership's not in a narrow definition of the titles we hold or other leaders hold in the room, but leadership is a notion at every single level that we legitimately believe, no matter where you're at in our organization, you have those leadership skills and capacity and identity, and using that to encourage people to be open and challenge you and abandoning your own ego to come up with better ideas. I think it's a very practical thing we should try and enforce and do that for one another.
That's great. Kevin?
Oh, I would echo all of those things. I think we were just on a senior leaders conference, and they had said when the leader speaks first on an idea, the number of ideas goes down by 50%.
Totally.
So the leader who speaks first, it has a huge impact. I think as leaders, we have to be curious, we have to listen, we have to model the behaviors we want to see, we've got to articulate what we're looking for, and we have to hold people accountable for that. But I think we really have to walk the talk, and we have to demonstrate that ourselves. And and it starts right at the top of the organization. If the CEO demonstrates it permeates through the organization. And if you don't have leaders who are walking the talk, it'll never happen.
Yeah, so true. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most powerful things a leader can do in a meeting is not say anything, right? It's just sit and listen and not drive the conversation. And I think it's important that as leaders that you put together a diverse team, right? That you sometimes you get caught in this trap of, well, I'm successful, I'm a leader, so in order to be successful in a leader, I need to hire people like me. And the reality of it is that that's not going to work out. If you're trying to put together a team, you're trying to put together a hockey team, for example, and you have a team full of goalies, and they're the best goalies in the NHL, you're never going to score a goal, right? So you got to think about when you're putting together a team to make sure that you've got that diversity, and not just diversity in terms of the color of your skin and the religion that you practice, but diversity of your thought. And one of the things that we do at CABC, where we're champions of this, and we very much support it, is we put all of our leaders through unconscious bias training. So we go through this training where you try to realize, as much as you want to think you don't have a bias, you tend to actually have a bias. So one of the things that we've done that's a great idea that you can do the next time you hire someone is just ask your HR professional the next time you get that short list of resumes, take the names off the resumes. Don't have the names, and go through it and rank it. And then go through it again with the names on there and see how your rankings change. And you'll find, as much as you want to say, I don't have a bias, you'll rank them quite differently when you see the names. So.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Maybe I'll just put a plug on that particular point, because I think you both touched on curiosity as well. There's a article that we published recently that talks about 6 traits of inclusive leadership, and it talks about what the 6 C's are, and that includes curiosity, cognizance of cultural diversity, commitment, collaboration. But those are, I mean, it's important courage is another one of them as well. I think it's important sometimes to have some sort of frame of reference in how, when we lead and engage on a day-to-day basis, to evaluate ourselves against some of those criteria, to say, am I showing up every single day with courage? Do I call out others when they're actually not acting inclusively? Am I giving space to others to stand up and do the same thing as well? And then sharing those experiences allows others to also hold us accountable to it.
I think Kelvin's comments earlier were quite interesting, because I've seen it in some leaders who are newer to working in Asia, and they'll go to a country and they'll expect that a leadership team should look like them. And that's not how the leadership team looks in the Philippines, right? Like it's the culture is different. And if you don't, and the culture, there is no Asia, by the way. The culture is different in all the countries. We were in 7 countries, 7 markets, that's different in all the markets. And I think the most important thing is you try to step back and listen and learn and put yourself in listen mode. And that's really hard for Western executives to put themselves in listen mode. And that's something that I spend a lot of time coaching, having come back, is to say you've got to step back and listen. And it's really important.
I'll often talk to our teams about empathy and perspective, and really understanding the person on the other side, and what is it, where do they come from, you know, maybe what meeting did they just come from, and have, you know, that connection. So, you know, I'll end the panel with a question that I'd like each of you to answer. And it is, you know, in this, the theme here is about being bold and being different, and you each have your personal journey. So if you could impart one piece of advice to the people in this room about your own journey and how being bold and being different, whether it's an example or whether it's advice, what would you impart?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about my personal journey. When people ask me where I'm from, I'll say I'm Korean, and they'll go, "Do you speak Korean?" I'm like, "No," and they say, "Well, why?" And I used to always say, "Well, it's because my grandparents never lived with me, right? And their grandparents lived with them, could speak Korean, but it actually was deeper than that, right?" And I think for me, it's about the environment, and I'll tell you my journey, right? So my parents emigrated; they're Korean. They lived in Germany for a couple of years. We came to St. Catharines, Ontario. So we were plopped into St. Catharines, Ontario. Sister and I were the only Asians in the school. We didn't speak English. We spoke German, so people were looking at us going like, what the hell is this, right? And I gotta say, it was brutal. It was brutal growing up because of that environment. I got made fun of because of my eyes. I got made fun of because I came to the house, food that my parents were cooking, the smell of the food, and I'm embarrassed. I didn't want to speak Korean. I didn't want to be Korean, right? And my parents would try to speak to me in Korean. I'd be embarrassed. I'd talk English, and I fought it, right? As a result, I didn't embrace my culture. You know, we would have to go Toronto to buy our groceries, because you couldn't buy groceries in St. Catharines. So we would go to Toronto, buy our groceries, and we'd always go to a Korean restaurant to eat. My sister and I, we fought it so much, we said, we're not eating Korean food in the restaurant. Buy us KFC. My parents would buy us KFC. We'd eat KFC while they ate Korean food, right? And the restaurant didn't care. They must have been used to it. But, you know, and I gotta say, that was tough. Right? It was tough for my parents. They didn't fight it because they wanted the best for us. And the reason why I go through this is, as leaders, as you start getting into leadership positions, as you start putting together teams, it's not just about the people on your team, it's about the culture that you create. It's about creating an environment where it's okay to be different, that if you're bold and you're different and you have a different religion, you have accent, that's okay, that's something to be celebrated. And if you can create that type of environment, it's amazing what will end up happening as a result of that. And me having gone through that experience of feeling what it was like to be the outsider and was embarrassed to be different, that taught me to be a better leader. That taught me about, I'm never gonna do that when I create a team. I'm never gonna do that with my family. And so for me, that it's about, not about more about yourself being bold and different, but about making sure that you create an environment so everybody else can be who they are and not be embarrassed about themselves.
We should go to Korean food. So I moved to this country 17 years ago. So I am an immigrant. I wasn't born here. I wasn't raised here. And I was living in Dubai before I moved to Calgary, Alberta. So I vividly remember I was working for EY at the time, a very good competitor of ours. I was working with EY, and we had a few options. And the options were the following. You could go to Calgary, you could go to Houston, you could go to St. John, and Halifax. And I'm not sure why we chose Calgary. But the day I remember vividly, because it was Valentine's Day 17 years ago, and it was plus 50 in Dubai, so Celsius, and it was minus 40 in Calgary. So it was very clear to me that I was in a cold, foreign country very quickly. But going backwards as well, growing up as well, I lived in 5 different countries. I'm Indian, I was born in India, but I live in the UK, the US, traveled around the world, went to a different school every different year. So I never felt like I belonged anywhere. I've lived in Canada for 17 years, and the first question most people ask me is, so where are you from? And my answer is, from here. I feel like I'm from here. So my journey has been fascinating in some ways, because as an immigrant, I also consider myself very lucky that even though I moved here on 17 years ago on Valentine's Day on a cold, frozen day, I had the opportunity to go to work the first day I landed. And this country opened up its arms and told me that anything was actually possible and achievable. Now, along the way, a lot of people give you advice, and the big advice in the consulting world is going to be build relationships, and the way you build relationships in Calgary is you golf, and you play hockey, and you watch football, which isn't soccer or football the way I grew up. And trust me, I just can't do that. I have never wanted to actually do that. To date, by the way, if I watch a hockey game, I can't see the puck. I don't know where that is. I have never been able to see it. So I should get my eyes checked, which is a different point. I guess my message would be that at the end of the day, if there's one piece of advice I give, as we get older, we give advice, is be authentic to yourself. It is very hard being somebody else. It really is. And as you hear our stories and other inspirational stories in the room as well, trying to be the best version of yourself is probably the most amazing contribution you can make to society and communities you operate in. But while we do that, stand for something. Stand for something you're going to be the best at, that you'll make an impact on. For me, growing up, particularly in this country, my standing up was, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to stand for the fact that I could take an idea, incubate it, commercialize it, and actually provide employment opportunities to others. I wanted to stand for it. And so in however way it's authentic to you, use that authenticity to stand for something.
Kevin?
I think those are great stories, and I'm going to take a slightly different tact, and I'm going to maybe try to give some career advice, and I'll give you career advice. I'll give you 2 examples from my own personal life, but the first thing I would say is that all of you need to make people aware of what your career objectives are. If people don't know what your objectives are in the organization, they can't guess, right? So if you want to be the chief auditor of CIBC and you've never told anybody, it's hard for them to guess at that. So I remember my first conversation with the CFO of a company called Mutual Life Clerica was that someday I wanted to run a business. And I was in my early 30s, and I thought this would be a long conversation for a long time away. And she came back to me, and actually she was one of the first female financial services CFOs around, but she came back to me and said, we would like you to run our pensions business. And I'm like, well, I don't know anything about pensions. I've never been in the pensions. I kind of knew there was a difference between a defined contribution and a defined benefits. And I had all these people that worked for me that knew a lot about it. So, but I told them what I was looking for. And the second advice I would say is take a chance sometimes, right? And I think it's really important that you have to dive right in. And I think that this group they all know the importance of relationships. And one of the biggest things I did in that job, because I didn't know anything about the pensions business, was I built relationships and I listened and I talked. And actually, in fact, we had 2 of the best years we'd ever had in that business. 7 years ago, around, well, it was actually a little longer than that, probably 8 years ago, our CEO came to me and said he wanted me to run Asia. And I said, Dean, I've only been to Asia once, and it was only 1 week, and we were 2 days in Mumbai and 2 days in Shanghai. I don't know anything about Asia. And he goes, well, I think you can do it. So I took a chance, right? And I did the same thing. I tried to make sure I built relationships, I learned. But if you didn't take the chance, you weren't going to get that experience. So I think you have to tell people what you're looking for. You have to think about what you're looking for, and then on occasion, you've got to take that chance and believe in yourself as you move into those roles. And you need to use the skills that you've all developed. And so my advice would be tell people what you're looking for, take a chance.
It's wonderful. So courage, authenticity, and empathy.
Yeah, that's good.
We can summarize. So thank you so much for your time tonight. I think that the learnings and your experience that you've imparted on all of us has been so valuable. So appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.